Welcome, everybody. This is a really cool day because Israel gets a king. Now, you're on a bicycle. Why don't you come in here? Today's going to be a big day. It's all about Israel gets a king. And at the end, you're going to be so excited they get a king that you're going to celebrate, aren't you?
Yes, and there's going to be a surprise.
Anything special happened to you this week? Nothing? Okay.
My mom was doing something and she had to tell us, so we had to stop the video. But now we're going to...
Already, this is take 2, and it's better because we're going to have a lot of fun because we got some cool things to talk about. So, Israel gets a king. Samuel got to be a really old man while he was judge over Israel, and his 2 sons were judges also. Unfortunately, the sons of Samuel were not honest men. They were not good dudes, and they took bribes and the like. So the Israelites came to Samuel, and they said, "We're tired of being ruled by judges. We think having a judge rule over us is wrong and stupid. We want a king like the other nations around us." Samuel was naturally grieved because this was an attack on him, and he had been judged for so long. So he prayed to God, and God answered him and said, "Samuel, don't feel so bad about it. Sure, they're rejecting you, but they long ago rejected me, and you're no better than I am. There comes a time when people insist on having their own way. They want exactly what they want and when they want it, and the only way you can prove to them they're wrong is to let them make the big mistake by doing what they want to do. So go ahead and anoint the king, but you better tell them that they're just asking for trouble." So Samuel called the elders of Israel together and told them that if they had a king, they'd be sorry, for the king would levy taxes. It means they'd make taxes and they would cheat them out of their money, and their sons and daughters would wind up being servants. And there'd be a time when they'd be really, really sorry, and they'd cry out to God, and God really wouldn't listen to them. But the elders were very stubborn, and they insisted on having a king. So Samuel said they could. There was a young man of the tribe of Benjamin named Saul. And he was a really big guy. He was about 6'6" tall, kind of like a basketball player. His daddy had sent him out looking for a herd of donkeys that had strayed away from home. But Saul couldn't find his father's donkey, so he looked up Samuel and asked him where they were, for Samuel was a prophet. And he figured Samuel could ask God where they were, and God would reveal it to him. When Samuel saw Saul coming towards him, God spoke to Samuel and said, "That's the man you want to make a king." That's right. And so Samuel said to Saul, "While you were out looking for the donkeys, they strayed back home. And now your father has got folks out looking for you. But never mind that. I'm going to anoint you king over all the Israelites." Saul protested that he was not worthy of such an honor. But Samuel said, "Don't argue with me about that. If God says you're to be the king, that settles it." So Samuel took a bottle of oil, like Papa does when I anoint people on the forehead, and he poured it on Saul's head, for that's the way the ceremony goes for making a man a king. And they did that for the Queen of England, too, in early 50s. So then, Samuel then told Saul that as he was traveling on his homeward journey, he would come upon a company of prophets, and that he should accompany them. And that God's Spirit would come upon him and change him into another person, and that's just the way it happened. So, Saul went home to his parents. Yep, he did. And pretty soon, Samuel called a meeting of all the Israelites at the town of Mizpah. He took Saul and stood him up before all the people and said, "Here's the man God has chosen to be your king." And all the people shouted, "Hooray, hooray! God save the king." Can you say that?
God save the king.
Long live King Saul.
Long live King Saul.
Saul began at once to recruit a band of soldiers as a sort of king's bodyguard, because he felt it wasn't right for a king not to have an army. About that time, a war party of Ammonites invaded the country and attacked the town of Jabesh Gilead. The men of Jabesh figured that they were beaten before they started to fight, so they offered to surrender to the Ammonites and be their servants if the Ammonites wouldn't kill them. The Ammonites answered that they would accept a peaceful surrender, but that they would put out the right eye of every man of Jabesh Gilead. Now that didn't sit too well with the men of Jabesh Gilead. So they sent messengers to King Saul, asking him to come quick and save them from the Ammonites. It made Saul angry to hear what the Ammonites threatened to do. So he took a yoke of oxen that's like a big bull, and he cut them into little pieces, and he sent a piece or two to all the towns of the Jews with the message that if they didn't come help him fight against the Ammonites, he'd come and cut up their oxen. Well, sir, the Israelites gathered together, and there were 330,000 of them. You think about that, Betty. How many? 330,000 of them. And they came and they attacked the Ammonites and scattered them like a covey of quail, just like doves, and chased them back home again. Then Samuel had gathered all the people together in Gilgal, and they had a big victory celebration, and everybody said they thought Saul was going to be a great king. While everybody was gathered together, Samuel preached one last sermon warning them that if they didn't continue to serve the Lord God Jehovah, and if they forsake him to serve the false gods and idols, then God would punish them. But if they were faithful to God and continued to obey him, he'd bless them. And everybody was so happy that they said, "Amen, brother." For 2 years, everything went pretty well. And one day, Jonathan, Saul's son, who was captain of a band of soldiers, attacked the garrison of the Philistines and defeated them. That made the rest of the Philistines mad. They were really angry. And they got together a huge army and they invaded the Hebrew lands, so that the Jewish people fled before the invaders and hid themselves in caves and in thickets. Saul tried to muster his forces, but everybody was so scattered that they all could get together. It was about 600 men. So if you would look in the screen and say hi to everybody, they had 600 men. He sent for Samuel, and Samuel didn't come. So Saul offered a sacrifice to the Lord, which he ought not to have done, because he wasn't a priest or a prophet himself. Samuel got there just about the time Saul finished with sacrifice. He was so mad at Saul that he turned right around and he left. In the meantime, the Philistines had conquered the lands of Hebrews, and they ruled them very harshly. Among other laws they passed was one forbidding any Jew to be a blacksmith, so they couldn't make swords and spears and other weapons of war. So whenever a Jew needed a blacksmith to make a plow or sharpen a pruning hook, he had to go to Philistine city to get it done. Saul and his 600 men were still keeping together, and it seemed such a pitiful little handful with which to oppose the huge army of the Philistines. And mostly all of them did was run and hide from the Philistine army that was out chasing them. One day, Jonathan and his armor-bearer crept away from Saul's tiny little band and quietly approached the Philistine army. Jonathan proposed a test. He said, "Let's show ourselves on top of that hill. And if the Philistines come after us, we'll know that God will not help us. But if they call us to come to them, then let it be a sign that God will deliver them into our hands." Well, that was a pretty daring and desperate thing. Just 2 men, Betty, were attacking that entire army. And sure enough, when the Philistines saw them standing up on the hilltop, they called out, "Come over to us, Jews, and we'll show you a thing or two." Jonathan was delighted, for he felt in his bones that this was a sign of God would fight with him. And Jonathan, being a friend of great faith, felt that God could beat the whole Philistine army with 2 men as easily as he could with his army. So Jonathan and his squire charged into the Philistine camp and began to kill the Philistines. They killed about 20 of them right off the bat, and the rest of the Philistines got into a panic, and they began to escape. They were so many that they fell over all over each other and started to fight. each other in their haste to get away. And they yelled and shouted. Saul's 600 men heard the noise and rightly guessed what was happening, because they missed Jonathan. So they also charged into battle. Then all the other Jews came running out of the caves where they had been hiding, and pretty soon Saul had a good-sized army. And they chased the Philistines all over the countryside. Just before Saul's 600 men attacked, he had ordered that not one Jew should eat a bite of food until the Philistines had been defeated. Jonathan, however, didn't know about this. The battle was raging far and wide, with Jews chasing Philistines every which way. Yeah. And Jonathan came to a place where some honeybees had a hive, and he ate some of the honey. Some of the Jews who were with him by that time said, "Oh no, you shouldn't have done that." King Saul said that nobody should eat anything until the Philistines were defeated. Yep. Jonathan said, "Oh, for goodness sake, if we all had plenty to eat, we could fight better." They had captured a lot of Philistine food, and so the Jews who were with Jonathan sat down, and they ate even without saying the prayers. You know how you do? When you say grace, they didn't even say the grace. Kind of like, just let's snap up the food. Late that evening, Saul sent word out to his army that it was all right to eat now, and he prayed and asked God whether to continue to chase the Philistines all night. And God wouldn't answer. Saul figured it was because some Jew had broken the vow that King Saul had made for all of them, not to eat anything until the battle was over. Saul declared that whoever had done this thing would surely be put to death. Jonathan confessed that if it had been he, and I believe Saul would have put him to death, he was that mad. Except that all the people whooped and hollered and said, "Heck no, you're not going to put Jonathan to death. Why, he was the man that won this victory for us by attacking the Philistines in the first place." By the time Saul and the Jews had settled that squabble, the remainder of the Philistines had gotten away, so that ended the battle. But Saul was going great guns by now. So he continued to do battle against all the enemies of the Israelites, and pretty much all the time he was victorious. And the Jews began to come up in the world. Of course, he never did completely defeat the Philistines, but he drove them back into their own lands and cities. So that
the Jews were pretty much independent once more.
They were independent once more. Now, I want to see how people act whenever they're excited about a king. Do you have something here that you can show us in the trampoline? How people get excited? I want to see how excited people can get. Let's see if you can be able to do that. So let's see what you have over here. Let's see if you're as excited as I think maybe you are. And look over here and say, "Yay! Long live the king! Long live King Saul! Long live the 6'6" king! And bless his family! And may he live forever!" Until next week, have a very happy week.